Hi, and welcome to Mark's Motivational Podcast for another Authors Tuesday. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by another great author, David Lohan. So you're very welcome along tonight, David. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you, Mark.
Grant. Yes, so we might just start off the podcast today. If you'd like to explain to the listeners a little bit about yourself and the books you've written, I just found very interesting.
Sure. So I'm an engineer by background, but about 10 years ago, I did some voluntary work for a charity based here in Cork. And the charity was Cush China, so by the fireside in the Irish language. And it was an outreach service of the Society of African Missions, the SMA Fathers. And it was for newly arrived African migrants, so arrived into Ireland. And those people brought a lot of issues with them. And one of those issues was human trafficking, an issue that we know otherwise as modern day slavery. So I volunteered at that time to undertake some research work. That's all I knew at the time. And it turned out that the research was into the issue of African witchcraft, which we would know as juju or voodoo, and how that's used in exploiting people from certain parts of Africa, particularly into the sex trade in Europe and other parts of the world. And from that work that we did, we undertook a publication then, which was called Open Secrets, an Irish Perspective on Trafficking and Witchcraft. I co-authored a book on that. And I've remained faithful really to the area ever since. And that's led me then onto wider research on the issue of human trafficking or modern slavery.
Okay. And you've done this kind of a voluntary, like for this charity, David, haven't you? Just well done for that. That's brilliant.
Oh, it was a fantastic charity, Cush China.
Yeah.
As I say, run by the SMA Fathers. It was headed by a Father Angelo Lafferty over a great many years. It did wonderful work. It was a place where you encountered people from, all walks of life, people from Africa, people from Europe, people of all creeds, people of none, people with, everyone brought themselves. It really was a wonderful place. So, it was a pleasure in itself to be able to do the work. And, I became enamored with the issue of human trafficking and trying to understand the plight of victims and the causes of their victimhood. And also, what could be done to kind of alleviate the situation. And that's, very much remained in my heart ever since. And in the time after that, I did a master's in politics at University College Cork. And I did my dissertation on the issue of human trafficking, obviously. And I looked at policy, particularly the policy that was adopted in Sweden and also that was adopted in the Netherlands. There's very different approaches. And they took those roads 20 years ago. So I felt, well, look, maybe we could take a look now to see what each one of those produced. And then stemming from that work, that led me on to my current work, my current publication, which is at Freedoms Crossroads, Making Sense of Modern Slavery.
Great. Yeah, because you could see how the situation was developing. There was a good way of you kind of helping in your way as well, so that's brilliant, isn't it? Like and when did the writing begin for you? Have you always been a writer yourself, or where did that part start?
No, very much around that time. Is a great question, because actually as an engineer, I would normally have been quite succinct in what I've written. It usually boils down to 5 or 6 points, and you make your points, and it ends there. So typically as engineers, we tend to understate rather than overstate. So there was actually a bit of a transformation there for me in terms of, being more descriptive about things and, exploring things maybe in a bit more detail at times as well. So very much around 10, 12 years ago, I found actually I had a flair for writing, certainly an interest in it. And just a number of factors came together. I think the research and with the studies I did at University College Cork, where I did a higher diploma in politics the year before I did the master's. And I found those 2 years to be really, really beneficial. And I took so much from those 2 years at University College Cork. They were very worthwhile, and just really something that from a personal development point of view, that really helped me grow as an individual. and certainly helped this work.
Great, David. And is it purely politics you write about, or do you do any other kind of writing yourself, David? Have you is is it different?
Yeah.
Do a different kind type of writing?
No, generally it's on just on the issue of, so it's a
Okay.
non-fiction work relating to human trafficking. That's
Yeah.
particularly what I focused on. I do run a
Mm.
website as well at
Okay.
www.davidlohan.com.
Mm.
And again, it's on the issue of human trafficking. But when I get the
Yeah.
opportunity to write, it is on this issue. I must
Great.
admit, I have
Yeah.
played with the idea of writing on other things, but I haven't got there yet.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
someday.
Mm. And where can people get this book? Is it available in bookshops, or where can people get your books, David?
So you can get it from Kenny's. Kenny's in Galway stock the book.
Okay.
It's also on
Yeah.
Amazon and a whole pile of other online retailers. So it's in three
Mm.
versions. It's a Kindle book. So for anyone who wants the ebook, you can get it in Kindle version from Amazon, and you can get the
Mm.
paperback and also the hardback as well. And it can be ordered from really any bookstore.
Great, that's brilliant. Yeah, and because what you can do as well, David, you can probably share the links with myself, and I'll put them on the
Thank you,
podcast
Dave.
show notes as well. I know, of
Yeah.
course, yeah, yeah, great stuff. And do you have like any favorite authors yourself? What kind of books do you like to read yourself, David?
I suppose, yeah, when I've read is, a lot of the time would be kind of political types thing, political history.
Mm. Yeah,
I read a book some years ago on, that was particularly stay with me on Churchill, which I thought was a wonderful book, and a
okay, yeah,
biography of
yeah,
Churchill. I like
mm.
biographic works, particularly of military individuals as well.
Yeah,
And that kind of work, military generals, wars, that kind of stuff. And I
yeah,
think it gives
yeah,
a wonderful idea of history, of the way
mm.
politics actually works, the position people are in, and how they act in those type positions. And I
Yeah,
very much believe that, you have to understand the context in which a person is acting. So you really have to
mm.
understand their historical position when you're trying to understand what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. So
Mm.
it requires a certain level of empathy, I think, for a person's
Yeah,
position. And that doesn't necessarily mean we always agree with them, but you still
yeah,
have to try and understand where they're at that time. And I think that's helpful too, that, I bring that to the subject of human trafficking as well, of trying to understand, where all the different actors are coming from, why they're doing what they're doing. And that's very much of interest to me, particularly in my current work, where I really explore, like, what is slavery? Why does slavery happen? I'm not so interested so much in terms of, where it happens necessarily, but trying to get under the skin of slavery and to understand why and what can be done about it.
yeah,
Unfortunately, when you read an awful lot about slavery, that a lot of the stories tend to take on very much the same kind of theme, to the point that you'd
mm.
almost think, well, have I not read this before? Which is the
Yeah,
terrible tragedy about it, of course. It's not just the telling of a tale, but the retelling of that same tale time and again.
mm.
Unfortunately, it seems to be without end. So I'm very
Yeah,
interested in the why. Why is all this happening? What can be done to end it?
yeah. No, fair play to you, David. And did it take you long? I know you probably had to look into a lot of research, and like
Yeah.
it said, there was a lot of that involved in the book. But did it take you long to write the book, David, yourself?
It did. Yeah, it took an awful long
Yeah,
time actually. I
yeah,
suppose it had its origins in that dissertation I did back in 2012 for
yeah,
the Masters in Politics, and
yeah,
I grew that. Then I wanted to expand upon that work by drawing in
mm,
yet another policy area, which was the system that was adopted in New Zealand, where they
mm,
decriminalized prostitution in a response to sex trafficking, and they wanted to see, well, would this improve the situation? So now I ended up with
okay,
looking at the policy approaches of Sweden, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. But beyond that, what I wanted to do was take a big jump back in time, back 160 years ago, and a bit more besides. And I looked at the writings of the pre-Civil War writings of authors in the United States. And you have three parties there that were writing. One were the slaveholders, so they could be very frank about slavery. You could, in a way that we couldn't possibly get today. Obviously, no one's going to, face up today that they're a slaveholder. But the slaveholders
mm-hmm,
back then wrote an awful lot about slavery, and there were arguments for slavery. And then you also had the writings of people who had escaped from slavery, former slaves, and we know those names ourselves. Some people like, say, Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup as well, another famous name. And the third group of people who wrote about slavery were abolitionists, people who were vehemently against slavery in all its forms and wanted to bring an end to it. And one of the things I was especially interested in, and I use this at the start of the book, the first third of the book is dedicated to this, is looking at slavery as it existed in the United States before the Civil War, and trying to bring together those three different perspectives: the slaves themselves, former slaves, slaveholders, and abolitionists, and to see, could you draw a common picture of what it meant to be a slave, and what was slavery all about? What were the core elements around slavery? And how could you then take that understanding forward 160 years and look at the contemporary situation, which is the second part of the book is about, what modern slavery looks like. And before then moving on to a much more advanced perspective on how sex trafficking emerges in the area of prostitution and what really should be done about that to try and tackle it. So that kind of encompasses the whole book essentially.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Like they've gone back so far to kind of see the history of it as well. That's really interesting, David. Thanks a lot for sharing that with us. That's brilliant. Yeah, because it kind of reminds me. I was watching a program there recently. I think we spoke about on TG Carr, where what's his name again? Well-known character.
Hector, was it Hector?
Yeah, Hector. That's why he went over to a country and he investigated. And it was very interesting the way it was, like you were saying, they kind of saw how it was happening and ways to reduce the problem, which is great. Like it's interesting, very interesting.
And it's a wonderful point, because you see, that's the thing. I suppose a lot of people who do very, working in various capacities abroad, and when they go abroad to some countries, one of the things they come face to face with, and this work could be environmental work, it could be humanitarian work, and it could be, in the area of trying to combat slavery. Some people it's religious work, going abroad as missionaries. But one of the things they come face to face with is slavery. And this is something perhaps that they don't expect to find, but that they do find. Now, that being said, we also need to be careful, of course, because slavery exists here in Ireland as well. Predominantly slavery exists in probably just a few countries. That's the majority are accounted for, as always, by the few. But that's not to say there's no slavery in Ireland. There certainly is slavery in Ireland. Human trafficking goes on everywhere. And, it's about realizing that, and for the authorities of different countries to go and look for it. And invariably, when they do go look for it, they certainly find plenty of instances of it.
Yeah, that's great, David, and I really commend you there. Because by writing these type of books, it kind of opens people's minds to what exactly is going on. Because people would have a perspective of, as you say, prostitution, all that kind of stuff. But when they really read your book, they'll know more about it. Would that be correct?
Exactly, yeah, and it's spot on. I mean, really, it's going back and taking that kind of historical context stuff, and so stepping out of kind of maybe the present political debates, going back to 160 years, saying, look, the people who are writing about slavery aren't involved in those politics. They couldn't be, because they lived 160 years ago. They didn't even know what the debates were. They're just writing about situations that existed in their time. What can we find out about slavery from them back there independently, and what then can we take forward? And I think particularly when it comes to the sex trade, absolutely, people kind of convey that prostitution is the world's oldest profession. But what they don't realize in conveying that is that actually what you're actually describing something then from the characteristics going back 160 years ago. Obviously, it would have been identified as, amenable to slavery, is that certainly prostitution is an activity that's ideally suited to slavery, and the exploitation that occurs in prostitution can be of no surprise, and it will continue to be the case, because the nature of the undertaking is completely compatible with slavery. One of the insights that I thought was really interesting when I was taking on doing the work was that there was an Irish political economist, John Elliott Cairns, the The Cairns School of Business in Galway is named in his honour. It's called University, named in his honour. But he wrote a book in the 1850s. And one of the observations he made about the United States was how in the north and the south of the United States, there were very different crops. And he thought the line between the north and the south demarcated that division between the crops that they had in the north and the crops they had in the south. And in that simple observation, what he was pointing to was that really why slavery existed in the South was because of the crops that they had that were particular to the South. Slavery had no utility in the North because it didn't grow the kind of crops. So it grew, for example, the likes of wheat, in which he figured you couldn't probably use slavery. It was too spread out. The work was too spread out to use slavery. And others observed too that people in the North weren't necessarily so moral, that, you know, had those crops existed, those same crops existed in the North, you probably would have found a lot of people in the North would have petitioned themselves to use slavery at the North, where it never was used. So it's, you know, it's a very interesting subject, and we can take all those realizations from the past and, you know, relearn from the past, in effect, things that people knew to be the case 160 years ago, and apply them to the present. I think one of the important things too, or I suppose two important things about slavery, like why is it important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is that, you know, over 40 million people around the world are taught, and it's estimated at the moment, the number is always increasing, are taught to live in conditions of slavery today, which is probably a bit of a surprise to us, not the way maybe we think of the world. But the second reason I think it's also important is that if we know about slavery, if we understand what slavery is, then it also shapes our understanding about freedom, which I think is really, really important. You know, and what's the nature of freedom that we have? And is our freedom the freedom that means just acquiring freedom ourselves, but at the expense of our fellow man? Or is it the different character of freedom, where, you know, it's about securing freedom for ourselves, but not at the expense of, you know, our fellow human beings?
Wow, that's great. Yeah, you're dead right. I agree with you there, David. Brilliant. I know this you kind of answered this question already, David, but I just wanted to ask you, you know, when you're while you were doing this work on the book, you kind of answered it there, but like what kind of kept you motivated? Obviously you've got such a you've got such a heart for this subject, you know, for interest in this subject, but what kind of keep you motivated?
And it's a wonderful question. And, you know, it's, there are times when it takes everything from, I think, you know, and I suppose every author would probably know that there are times when you literally haven't another thing to give. And I hit that, I will confess to that I hit that at least 3 times. And for me, one of the things that was actually fortunate in ways, or at least there was a kind of a silver lining to, was that when the pandemic came along, I said, I'm going to make you good use of this time now, a bit more time. And I said, I'm going to put this to good use on a good cause. I said, I have the work nearly done, and I'm going to make the final push. But I think, you know, as authors, if you undertake any work and you really are giving it your all, sometimes the work itself exceeds your all, and sometimes you have nothing left to give. I suppose at times I would look at things and, you know, encounters that I had with certain things, and realized just how important the work was. And that gave me the heart to go back again and to take it up again and just to keep at it. But there were times when it was really, really difficult. It was a long slog. And I think, you know, anyone who writes a book will understand just how much you have to give of yourself. And, you know, I suppose it's a great accomplishment in life to write a book, and it's a success in itself, you know, to be able to get there. And sometimes, you know, we all have to suffer for our art a little bit as well, you know, and maybe it shapes who we are too.
Yeah, no, well done to you. Brilliant. That's a great great answer to that question. But is there anything else you're working on at the moment we'd like to share with the listeners? Is there anything else you're working on at the minute?
I suppose, like, you know, what I've always been, you know, advocating for, essentially, or have advocated. I've been fortunate, I suppose, to be in Ireland, where, you know, there's some great people who've advocated for the cause of people who are, you know, who have been exploited in the sex trade. And we have a law here in Ireland now that makes it illegal for punters of prostitution to pay for those services. I think that law is a very rational and effective approach. It's something obviously that we need to make sure as time goes on that's enforced, that we continue to enforce that, and we need to develop an understanding of that some of human trafficking, some of modern slavery is about the sex trade. It occurs in many other things, but from our own point of view, we really have to ask ourselves, what are the things that we support as consumers? When we actually put down our dollar, what are we buying? What's at the end of that? For some of us, that's what we buy at home, the stuff we put in our fridge, our groceries. For others, it's when we're in a corporate environment, and maybe we're buying stuff for companies, particularly things like their commodities. And we need to ask, well, where are these things coming from? Are they coming from a country where this particular commodity is associated with slavery? And we need to make sure that we're not buying those particular products from that situation. So that's kind of thing that we work on at the moment.
Great stuff. That's brilliant. And any other books that you're working on? Is there any other books in the pipeline?
I would like to do, I think, but it's a kind of work in progress. Maybe an audio version of the current book.
Great.
One.
Yeah.
So
have it there.
So I have a copy of it here. But it's a work in progress. I'm not sure yet. But we'll see in coming months. One of the other things
it looks great. The cover looks great. The book looks great there. It's a great cover. Yeah.
And the thing I wanted to do in the cover was to get to the humanity of the individual who's there, because it's really about the person who's in that situation. So it's kind of up close and personal, unapologetic, and that was it. Yeah. Focusing very much on the individual, and that's what it's really about, One thing I would say about slaves too, and I think it is important, is that sometimes we have ideas of what it means to be a slave. And a lot of the times those narratives aren't quite correct. And I suppose over the years, we've kind of, as a society, we've developed a more sophisticated understanding of people who have been in abusive relationships, say in a domestic violence type situation. And we understand now certain things about their situation. But if we wanted to have a more sophisticated understanding of slavery, we could probably take that same lesson that we've learned from the situation of domestic violence, and we could bring it forward to slaves. And this was even recognized 160 years ago by people who wrote about slavery back then. And one lady said to me, she'd been in a situation herself some years ago, and she generously contributed to the work of the book in the form of an interview. And she said, our chains are on the brain. And that was it. So, you won't see the physical chains. That's not the way this works. These are, ordinary people who seem to be out and about, seem to be, acting of their own volition, but that's not necessarily the case. You can't see. So we do have to have a more sophisticated understanding of what it means to be a slave.
Yeah, definitely. That's great, Stephen. It's great talking to you, David, about really, really good. Now just one other thing, just a great insight, really appreciate it. The way through COVID, you said, has COVID been tough on you in a writing perspective? It hasn't really, has it? Like, you've got a lot of work done through it, have you?
Yeah, I suppose I'm kind of person, I'll always be busy. I'm that kind of person. I always have projects. So there were a lot of things that it kept me busy, essentially. There was a lot of things that I needed to do in terms of the book, the final elements of getting it together. And these things took weeks. They took weeks and weeks. So, it was kind of a blessing in disguise in terms of the work, certainly where I was concerned. And I recognized the opportunity of it. And I made good use of it. So certainly, so some good came out of COVID too.
Yeah, exactly. You have to look at the good stuff that happens in every situation. I know it was it's horrible for a lot of people who lost people, all that, but it's good to concentrate on good stuff that comes out of a bad situation, I suppose.
Exactly. You have to find the good in every situation.
Yeah. And no, this is great. Thank you. And as well as that, could you give anybody a bit of advice from what you write in that book, for keeping themselves motivated I suppose you would probably may have your own schedule that you'd go for your writing, or a certain amount of words a day. Would you give anybody a little bit of advice of how you
Yeah,
did it?
I never worked on the words a day thing. I must say it never
Okay.
worked for me.
No.
What sometimes I would find that I would write very little in a day, but I would
Okay.
would want what I wrote to be good rather than writing so much. And other times I would sit down and I might have an awful lot of material written, and I'd be quite happy with it.
Yeah.
And I suppose there are a number of phases to writing, and sometimes you just have to put in the time and the slog of it, and that's it.
Yeah.
One thing I certainly do believe on is that when you come to editing, I think editing is extremely important. And
Yeah.
to me, it's like having a rough diamond. And this is your opportunity to shine and polish and cut away, things that seem quite precious. And sometimes you have to take the hammer and the chisel and knock off those bits, and you say, well, that's fine, but does it really contribute? And I think, Mark, you know exactly what I'm talking about here.
I do, yeah. Definitely.
And you just want to polish that work up so that it's really, really good. So I suppose every part of the work brings its own elements, essentially. I don't know that you can rush it. I've heard people writing books maybe one a year. That's certainly that's not the kind I couldn't do that. I mean, this has taken me years to write this, and several attempts over those years to complete it too.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, it's been brilliant, and I wish you all the success as well going forward with your future writing.
Thanks,
and that you were saying it's a website as well you have, isn't it, or is it a blog? Is it?
I have a website, www.davidlohan.com, and it gives a bit more information there about human trafficking, essentially. So some more information. I've always remained faithful to the whole juju voodoo thing, essentially, and the people that are particularly afflicted by that. In fact, I read a report recently, and even I was horrified by it. And this is one of the things about human trafficking: is occasionally it gives you a figure or a fact that even after all the years, and it said really that that 90% of the girls who had been trafficked, and they were talking about juvenile girls, not even women, who had been trafficked from Nigeria, had been to a shrine. So that basically meant that 90% of children trafficked from Nigeria to the sex trades, probably of Europe and some other parts, but predominantly Europe, had undergone these terrible, absolutely horrific juju rites, and were living in utter fear of their lives and controlled by this. And that was just one of those things that sometimes you read so much, sometimes it resonates with you, sometimes it doesn't. But this was one of those figures that I read, and it left me appalled, actually, quite frankly.
Oh God, yeah. So, it's like that film I watched a couple of years ago. There was a string of them. Liam Neeson was doing them, the Taken movies. But there was, I know it's like Hollywood stuff, but like it's kind of really based on what actually happens, isn't it?
It is. Now, it's the thing, the kidnappings thing tends to be sometimes too strong. Kidnappings do happen, and there are parts of the world where they would happen an awful lot, and I mean, I've seen things about villages where, nearly every household has had a child taken from them, but it tends to be for somebody, a lot of it tends to be very geographic, essentially. It's particularly strong in some areas, maybe people are doing that. But I think, again, a lot of what goes on in human trafficking is often more about deceit, where people are maybe offered a job and the job doesn't actually exist. And they're lured into a situation. Sometimes it's in their own country. People have this thing about travel. Human trafficking is not about travel. The word traffic, actually means trade, not travel. So people are lured into a situation, and they find themselves, maybe in a position of debt, that they supposedly owe someone a great deal of money because, they've taken up this role and now they've all sorts of obligations. And that's then turned on them in a certain way, as a kind of a very intangible form of force, and kept them in a position, and keeping them particularly in a position to do something that they don't want to do, but that's very profitable maybe for the person who has them doing it. So I think sometimes we have to, certainly the Taken movies had their place, but I would say that they're very, very kind of to the edge, essentially, of things that are going on. An awful lot of it's much more subtle than that.
It's a bit like cults kind of thing, isn't it? Like brainwashing
Yeah.
with cults. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That I suppose you come in at one premise, and once you're in there, that then maybe other things, that kind of the other forms of control are there, and they become maybe more apparent as time goes on. And there's an awful lot of that. Absolutely. Yeah, and people are controlled by that, and even I think sometimes a person's own sense of integrity is used against them. That really, they're saying, oh well, I took up this debt and I have to pay it back, and it's kind of my fault and all that. But actually, they're always, what they don't realize is they were deceived into this. This was always going to happen.
Yeah.
It's just really a script
yeah.
that's playing out control of their lives.
But once again, David, thanks very much for coming on. And I'd love to chat again with you sometime. You're always welcome back on the podcast. It'd be brilliant. But
Great, yeah. And thank you, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity so much.
No, but well done for highlighting all these issues. Like, thanks very much. And I wish you all the best again and everything you do going forward.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it so much. Okay. Good talking to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Great talking to you. So thanks everybody for tuning in to today's podcast with David Lohan. Isn't it Lohan? I've got that right, yeah?
Lohan, yeah. Lohan.
Lohan, sorry. Yeah, Lohan. So make sure to check out David's book. He's going to share the link that I'm going to put on the podcast. So join us again for another podcast on Thursday. Take care. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.
Cheers.